It's not quite my first digital event actually, but I'm not totally used to doing all the online presentation stuff. So if anything gets awkward in the middle, just bear with me. Thanks for the kind introduction, Nicholas. I'll just share my screen so oops, we can all see what's going on. I think I'll have to exit the screen. Here we go. Okay, I hope you can all see the presentation slide deck already. So tonight we're going to be looking at several things that you want to consider when going into digital health, and maybe take away a little bit of a motivation for actually doing so, because I think digital health is a really exciting area to be in, and it's also one of the very most coming areas of the next decade, I think, right? So Nicholas was already kind enough to give a short introduction, and I will just second this because just to give you a little bit of a background regarding where this presentation might actually come from. So, oops, my further educational career was actually that I first, like after high school, I studied medicine, right? And then during medical studies, my grandfather actually gave me a computer, and I got all soaked up in discovering programming and web development and things like that. So I found computer science really interesting, and I started studying computer science already during my medical studies. But then I finished medicine first, and I went to Berlin, to Humboldt University, for studying computer science right after. And after that, I actually did a PhD in computer science in a graduate program that already combined the computer science and the medical areas, which was called SOA-MED, studying service-oriented architectures, which is a certain computer science, like an systems architectural paradigm in the medical field of application. And after that, I just stayed in academia, first doing biomedical data research at Humboldt University, and then going to Charité and doing clinical data research there. At the same time, at sometime during the end of my PhD, I actually started doing freelance work as an IT consultant and software developer on the side, and then discovered, like, it took me almost 6 years really to discover that I actually liked working with real customers within real projects that have a much more immediate impact than research usually has, that I liked that much better than being in academia and writing papers. It took me 6 years, but at the end of the day, I actually, like about half a year before I left Charité, I started a company, 37 Binary, doing mostly software development and general IT consulting. And then a bit later on, I started splitting off all the digital health consulting from that, and I do that at Starlinger Plus right now. Okay, why am I telling you this? Well, how is this related to the topic of the presentation of today? So generally, if you look at this timeline, there are basically two types of areas here. The red areas are those times and occupations when I had access to classical health data, right? So what you think healthcare data in the healthcare system, that's the red areas, right? So when I studied medicine, of course, when you're at the hospital, you're dealing with patients, you can access their data. At Charité, when you're an employee of the Charité, you can access all the health data within your clinic. And then at the end of my computer science studies, I did my diploma thesis together with the Charité, so I actually had access to quite a lot of health data back then. But for the most part, like even being a physician, not working as a physician though, but more as a computer scientist, but for the most part of my life and my career, I have not had access to what you would call traditional healthcare data, and what you all might be thinking about when you think of health data, right? So that's the green area, right? If we look at this, this traditional health data a bit more closely, that's kind of what you see at the hospital, right? So this is an intensive care situation where a lot of different types of data are recorded automatically, right? So medication is actually digitally available in a pump, and it's recorded into the patient record. Documentation about the vital signs of the patient, their ventilation status, if they have a respiratory issue, all these kinds of things are recorded, and they're documented in a digital way, right? So if we look at Charité only, so year 2015, here is an example. They had 800,000 patient cases digitally recorded in their electronic patient records, right? Okay, now the problem is that, like for most of us, right, that this data is not accessible to us, right? It's behind a red line. And so while I was in the healthcare system, I had access to this data. And now that I'm no longer at Charité, and I'm no longer in the healthcare system as an employee or somebody who has access to this data, I'm outside. And this most likely applies to most of you just as well, right? So in a real presentation setting, I would be asking you now to raise your hand if you actually work in the healthcare system, just to get an impression, but we can't do this here right now. So I just, like, by statistics, I just assume that most of you do not work in the healthcare system and have access to traditional healthcare data, right? Okay, so what can we do? If we want to go into digital health and we don't have access to any of this data, how do we go about it? Now, to answer this question, let's first look at what patient data really is, right? So, and let's not actually look at patient data, let's look at health data, right? We want to talk about health data. So patient data in the healthcare system, health data more general. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see a number of different types of data, right? It starts with medication data. Obviously, then you have demographic information about the patient or person. You have encounters with physicians that might be recorded, diagnosis the person has, procedures taken at a hospital or in another setting. You have diagnostics that have been ordered, and the results of those diagnostic tests. You have genetic information, the social history of the person, family history, symptoms, the lifestyle, and socioeconomic factors, the social network of the person, and environmental data. So let this sink for a moment, because it might go beyond what you usually would consider health data, right? So most of the time when we think health data, we're at the top of this list, right? So we're all the bottom stuff, all our socioeconomic things or environmental aspects often don't pop up right away in our mind, right? But if you think environment, like allergies, right? So in spring, people with allergies often have more health problems, more health-related problems than during other times of the year. It kind of becomes more clear, right? Okay, the next slide might be a little bit overwhelming at first sight. We'll go through it step by step, so don't get scared off right away, right? If you wanna, I really recommend, I have the link to the original publication of this picture at the bottom of the slide. I really recommend you go to that publication to get a more in-depth description of all the different shades and facets of this picture here right now. But a couple of things that we wanna look at in detail are, number one, the blue areas, right? So these blue areas in the picture are those areas of data where that we have in a healthcare, in a clinical setting, right? So that's represented here. And one thing that you can see is that on the left-hand side of this graphic, we have structured data, and on the right-hand side, we have unstructured data. So what does that typically mean? That means that for instance, in an intensive care setting, so when I was at the Charité, I was at the Clinic for Anesthesiology and Perioperative Intensive Care, which is also what we saw the picture of the patient just before. And so in these settings, you have rather lots of structured data, like patient data that is recorded in a structured way and which lies in a database. And you have only few written notes, right? So when a nurse or a physician looks at the patient and they write down their general impression or their results of an examination, right? They write it as a text, and that would be unstructured data, because it's like for a computer, it is fairly unstructured, and it's not quite easy to use that for any kind of machine learning or data science related projects. Okay, so while in intensive care, the situation is that you have quite a lot of structured data, and you have not too much unstructured data here. In another very specific domain, which is radiology and pathology, you have less purely structured data in databases, but you also have another modality, which is imaging data, right? And a lot of the progress we're seeing today in AI in healthcare actually targets this imaging data, right? So I would consider that as semi-structured data because it has a very concise implicit structure encoded in the image itself, but it's not structured data all by itself. Now, apart from these two domains, intensive care and radiology pathology, most clinical data actually looks like this, right? So the typical clinical setting, you have very little routine care structured data, and most of the clinical recordings are in text format, right? Which is why digital health in the healthcare system is actually way, like light years away from where we all think it would be, right? So, I mean, of course, you've heard those presentations about how fax machines are still used in healthcare. That is true as well. But even when things happen digitally, a lot of the data, like the data that we can use for machine learning, is still hidden in those texts, right? And we have to extract them first. We will look at this very aspect in a little bit, just to give you an impression why it's so hard to extract that data. Okay, so, but what if we're not in the healthcare system? So I said, let's look at the data outside the healthcare system as well. So as you can see in the full picture, there are different kinds of sources where such data might be. So on the bottom right-hand side, for example, you have social media platforms like Twitter or Facebook, right? Which might seem surprising a little bit at first, but people just share their symptoms, for example, right on those platforms. I'm not feeling well today. Where do I get information about XYZ symptom, right? So people go on social media, they post their status there. I mean, there are people who actually post, like, overshare what feels like every single step in their digestive process, right? From food intake to the very end of that process. That's kind of what it feels to me on Facebook sometimes. So you have health information there. And then on the structured side, you also have a number of different sources. This graphic itself is from 2014, giving it a bit more of a concurrent touch. Let's look at what we can, like things that we might actually consider health data outside the healthcare domain today. So number one, still actually in the healthcare domain, we have the electronic patient record in Germany coming up, right? So I'm not sure if you followed this, but there's this whole thing where the Gematik has designed in a long year process an infrastructure where your physician can actually push electronic information about the diagnosis and the procedures and all the things that they record in the healthcare system into a platform that is accessible to you as a patient, right, or as a person outside the healthcare system to make use of this data. But we also have other things that have come up recently, like wearables, right? Every fitness band or every smartwatch will actually record information about your lifestyle, about some even about your ECG, right? So you can track your heart activity through those gadgets. They will record your vital signs, right? And all that stuff is health-related data. And I actually even drew a line here to grocery store purchases, right? Because some of these devices actually even allow you to pay at a grocery store, which obviously doesn't record your purchases on the device, but the electronic means of payment that you use will actually know that you are shopping at a specific shop at least. Okay. Another thing that's health-related is travel data, right, which is becoming ever more available. So travel data was number one recorded, of course, by your smartphone through GPS, for example, but it's and it gives information not only about the environment you're in, so relating it to health data. So where you are obviously says something about the environment you're in at that specific moment. And it also gives information about socioeconomic factors, right? So the more expensive your smartwatch is, the more income you might have, right? So there are actually, there's research that shows that smartwatches as a means to gain information out about a patient's or a person's health data is actually highly biased information, because a big range of society can actually not afford to buy a smartwatch, right? So that's quite interesting health data. And travel data is just the same, right? The more you travel, the more exotic and expensive places you travel, the more information about your socioeconomic information might be status might be gained. Okay, another type of data, and I've just added this picture as to represent microbiome data, which is basically all the bacteria that live in your guts, right? As a representative for those home care health data kits that you can nowadays just buy online, right? So you can actually buy devices that you can attach to your arm, and they will take a blood sample, you send them back in, and they will give you information about your vitamin status. Or you buy a kit, they send it to your home, you put a little bit of stool in there, you send it back in and they do microbiome assessment, right? So a lot of these healthcare data related services that previously were only accessible when you were in the healthcare system actually are becoming available to us as consumers to gain more information about our health data, right? And this information ranges from genetic information, right? Microbiome data, like all the stool that you send in there, also contains information about your personal genetics just as well, right? But it also goes to blood values, lab values, and medication data. Last but not least, just on this sample slide, are things that have been around for a long time, like bonus cards, right? So several of you probably have a payback card, right, that you show when you go to DM or Alnatura or Rewe or wherever, right? And these cards typically record what you actually buy, right? And of course, what you buy is like in terms of groceries and maybe drugstore products and other types of purchases, say something about your healthcare status, possibly even about your genetic status. So if you buy a lot of lactose intolerance products, then there might be a conclusion to be made about your healthcare system, about your genetic status. Okay, so this goes to show health data is everywhere, right? We produce it all the time. It's ubiquitous nowadays, right? All the gadgets, even our phones, even if we're not aware of it, GPS tracking, everything. It's related to our health, and it's data that we can use actually to create digital health products. Okay, question of course today is, who collects this data, right? So if you maybe screen your own data generation along these lines, who collects these data? Is it big internet companies? Is it Google? Is it Apple? Ask yourself that. Who owns this data? That's maybe more of a societal question. So once you generate this data, who owns it actually, right? Is it the company that collected it? Is it you? Is it the society? That's a tricky question. Who accesses this data? That's more of a practical question. Who actually has access to all the data you generate, right? Many times you not, right? Many times you do not have access to this data. And who combines this data, right? So, and the answer that we're trying to get to in this presentation is, should be me and most of you, right? We should be the people doing all of these things with our health data, and possibly if you're creating a digital health product, maybe even as a tool with other people's data. Okay, or it's Chuck Norris. We'll never find out. Okay, So let's look at these aspects. If you wanna go ahead, take digital health data and combine, own, access, and collect it, let's talk about some do's and don'ts that you want to consider, right? So this is basically the core of the talk, and we're going to talk about 6 different aspects that I think are most important for when you're either going into digital health or when you're in there already and you haven't considered all of these aspects yet. Okay, number 1, surprising number 1 maybe, use standards, right? So all the data we just saw, right, or most of the data we just saw can be described using standard vocabularies and identifiers, right? So in the healthcare domain, there are various well-known candidates. So ICD-10, for example, is used in the healthcare system to identify diagnosis and diseases you have, or OPS codes are used to identify procedures, right? SNOMED is a very international classification that for a long time was not available in Germany, but is becoming available in Germany right now. And information about these vocabularies and identifiers can be found on websites like the one of the DIMD, which is the German version of ICD-10 and OPS, and a number of other vocabularies, or the SNOMED website, right? So why is this important? It sounds super boring. Use standard, I mean, it's like, okay, let's do some exciting stuff with digital health data, but why use standards and vocabularies? Because they increase interoperability, right? So one thing that we typically find, for example, in a healthcare setting, is that for a single diagnosis, a single symptom, everybody uses a different word, right? If you ever want to be able to transfer data, even within your own application, but even more when transferring data from one application to another, and be allowing the application to know what diagnosis, what procedure, what medication is being talked about, you have to use standards, right? Standard vocabularies and identifiers. And at the same time, you also want to use standard data formats and API formats, right? In order to be able to exchange data with other applications, right? And that's something that we're currently not seeing a lot, right? Many digital health products are actually staying in their own very silo, right? They provide one function and one siloed function, but the health data they collect, like the apps that we use, the health data they collect, and the functions they provide are not interoperable, right? So if you want to go into digital health, consider going interoperable and not brewing your own, right? So data formats, a very modern data format as a successor of HL7 is very widely well known in the healthcare domain. Its successor, quite modern and with a lot of useful resources, is FHIR, right? So if you want to look at interoperability, FHIR is probably the first thing you want to go to. And then if you build really complex applications, integrating the healthcare enterprise, IHE, is something to look at just as well. Okay, so don't brew your own. Do use standards, don't brew your own data format stuff, okay? Not good style. And you can also contribute, right? So these standards organizations are typically very open for contributions, so you can also contribute there. Number 2, know your target domain, right? So if you've been working with data, any kind, and you think you can just transfer your FOO to the healthcare domain, check again, right? So let's look at an example here, right? Talking about applicability of your standard toolchain and on healthcare data, one classical example is natural language processing in healthcare, right? So we talked about these notes, letters, and reports, all that text data in the healthcare domain, and how that has to be mined first before you can actually make use of it for machine learning or any other kind of application, really. And so even for German language, for most languages, NLP pipelines exist, text mining pipelines that basically consist of 2 parts, where you first do linguistic preprocessing, right? So you take a text, you chop it up into sentences, you chop it up into words, you do a little bit of massaging on the individual tokens, and then you try to identify what the tokens or phrases actually mean, right? So which of these parts of the text is actually a diagnosis, which of them, and which diagnosis is it, and that kind of processing. So most of these tool chains have been trained on just regular text that looks like it's from a newspaper. So it's well written, edited, and just proper text, right? So if you have a text like this from a healthcare setting, which is a typical kind of text, it has no grammar and it has no consistent punctuation, right? And so all this linguistic pre-processing that has been trained on well-formatted, well-written newspaper text will basically fail, right? And at the same time, when you look at the bottom part, so where you've actually done all the pre-processing and you actually want to extract all the information from the text, you find that clinical text just has a lot of different acronyms, synonyms, homonyms, and idioms, right? And if you haven't dealt with any of this text-related this terminology before. So acronyms are just like abbreviations. Most of you will have heard of that, right? So COPD here as an example is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which you might have heard before, but an abbreviation such as BD, which you would just find in clinical text randomly. This is actually a real world example from intensive care texts. So in this setting, it just meant Bauchdecke, so that your belly, basically, which you will only know from context, which does not really have any kind of medical indication here, but which appears quite frequently in these kinds of texts, right? And there are acronyms all over the place, right? And synonyms are when two things are named the same, two different things are named, or one thing is actually named with several kinds of names. So PCP and PJP are two acronymic synonyms for a fungal infection of the lung, right? And they will just appear randomly depending on which physician actually put the diagnosis in the text, for example. Homonyms is when two different diseases have the same term, also very much related to acronyms. So here, HVI in German is actually either infection of your urinary tract or myocardial infarction, which are two very different things, right? So if you want to create an automated text mining pipeline, you have to tell those things apart quite well. And then you have idioms, right? So basically imaginary vocabulary that a physician just put there to follow a specific purpose. So C2, OH, EHOL, kind of for us as humans, maybe you recognize alcohol in there, right? But these are all terms, synonymous terms for alcohol abuse found in electronic health records at the hospital, right? For whatever reason, a physician put them there. Most of the time to actually not allow the patient to see that they're actually suspecting them of alcohol abuse. Okay, so the problem is that all these kinds of terms are typically not available in any ontologies that we might use or dictionaries that we might use to actually identify all those entities in the text we have, right? So of course this relates to clinical text, but it's quite similar for non-clinical, non-structured data that you find outside the healthcare system, right? Another option would be to have large-scale corpora. So if somebody just if you just had large amounts of text where a human had gone and annotated all those different terms, right? But those are typically not available either. So this step just fails for German too. Now, if you come here with your standard NLP pipeline and you want to try to analyze clinical text, it's obviously not going to work, right? So do know this kind of stuff depending on the data you want to look at. Know this stuff before you start, and don't think you can just use your standard kick-ass data science foo on health data, and then it's just not going to work, maybe. Okay, know this before you start. Number 3, mind data quality and bias, right? This is super important. because it's often overlooked, right? Health data is often low quality, right? Even within the healthcare system. So even within a structured data system, such as the intensive care unit, a lot of the data in the databases is not of the supreme quality you would expect it to be, right? And health data is often biased just at the same time, especially within the healthcare system, because much of the data is actually recorded by real human beings that do introduce bias, right? And it's also biased outside, right? So what are the questions related to these two aspects here that you should ask your data before you use it in a real-world digital health application? So questions about data quality are, how was the data that I'm trying to use collected, right? Was the data pre-processed before it was stored, right? So is it the raw data I'm seeing, or did some human maybe interact with the data? What errors might the data have been subjected to before it was stored? Do the variables that we see in the data actually tell us what we think they're telling us? A very current example of this is the whole COVID pandemic, right? So at the beginning of the pandemic, there were like pop-up data scientists, epidemiological experts all over the place, throwing data science analysis and dashboards and whatnot at us through every possible channel. And most of the time, all these questions were not considered, right? So for example, comparing reported numbers of deaths between countries is just really difficult, maybe impossible in a number of ways with the data we have, because the death toll data in different countries was collected in different ways, right? So that's one thing that you definitely have to consider when using health data, especially from different sources. And then regarding biases, you should ask yourself what populations are included in the data, right? So obviously, if you have if you have data from a population of people 65 plus, you will not be able to create a childcare healthcare product, right? Or even a product that's available for the general population, right? So always ask yourself which populations are present in the data, what types of health data are relevant to our app, and are they present in the data? So if you remember this listing of types of health data, right? Ask yourself, what do we actually need for our purpose? And is it present in the data, right? Okay, going on from this bias-related aspect, the do is establish data quality guidelines beforehand, right? Ask yourself the questions we just saw before you start working with the data, and then quantify everything in your data and know what your target limitations are, right? So you can only really say, like, create systems that reflect what is in your data, right? Not beyond. And don't think you don't have any bias and your quality is great. That's basically the don't. Think of this beforehand. Okay. Number 4 is one of my favorites, and I think I'll have to try to speed it up a little bit. But this is actually one of the most fun things because it's really, really important. So digital health software, or the digital health market itself in general, is highly regulated, of course. So there's medical device regulations and there's the data protection legislation, right? So what you don't want to do here is don't want to overestimate this problem, right? So you don't want to hide away. You don't want to hide away thinking you will never tackle regulatory things, but at the same time, you don't want to underestimate it, right? So what do I mean by this? Many of you may be coming from a machine learning and AI background. Maybe you've seen this this graphic here. So where your perception of the work you do is that machine learning code is actually a huge block of your overall system, right? And everything else is just on the side, right? In reality, so when you move machine learning systems to reality, it often is the case that all the things around that black code, here on the right-hand side, around that black code are much more important. Right, let's zoom in here a little bit to see what that really is. So it's the data collection process, data verification, it's your resource management, also hardware-related resource management, it's the feature extraction process, so everything that's necessary to actually make your machine learning code run. That is actually much more important, and it is even more so when it comes to regulatory in the healthcare domain, because there are a number of different questions attached to these various components that have to be considered. For example, some are actually related to the questions we just discussed regarding bias and data quality. So you want to know which outcomes are represented in the data. You want to know which hardware your system will run on and things like that. Not staying here for too long, when it comes to regulatory, again, this zoomed out version is actually not the reality itself, but only part of a reality, because it's a machine learning component inside a whole software architecture, right? So when you deploy a machine learning component, you need a lot of other components to interact with the user, to interact with maybe a database that you have, to do auditing, reporting, and things like that. And then again, when developing software in a regulatory compliant way, this whole software architecture is part of a software development process. And that software development process is part of a whole network of different processes that you have to follow in order to not only create the software, but to document it and to later bring it to market as a medical device, right? So even if you look closely, it's really hard to see the black machine learning box within the component diagram here on the bottom right. So when you're coming from AI and you want to go into digital health regarding regulatory, be prepared to look into these things. So it's not rocket science, but you shouldn't overestimate it, right? But you certainly shouldn't underestimate it either, and do the ostrich kind of thing, right? So the do here is make this top two of your agenda. Top one should still be your creativity, right? Think of all the great things you want to do, and then look at the regulatory part of things. Okay, or be Chuck Norris. Sorry about that. Okay, number 5. Look outside the box, right? So at first, when we're looking at all the different sources our data might come from, right? There are so many different sources of data that we of data that can currently be considered as health data and that we produce every day, right? So if you're not quite sure where to go, ask yourself what particular problem is yours maybe, and what data do you produce, and how can this data be used, and how is it related to your health, right? And then when you use this data, think outside the box, right? Don't look at only one particular type of data, but also look beyond borders, right? So these examples we're seeing now, I would say they're from Health 4.0, right? So where health data actually comes in from new kinds of devices that we have in various different places. But there's also, as we said before, there's also the healthcare system, and there's also different kinds of databases online with classical evidence and knowledge about healthcare, right? So just to give a few examples here, I think you can just Google these kinds of data sources where you actually have health data which is available to you online. For example, Mimic is an online resource of 50,000 patients with their intensive care data. It's all in English in this case, but that you can download and use this data to do research and to combine the information you extract from that data with new kinds of data. And there are also classical existing databases online which contain, like Civic, for example, information about genetics and cancer, right? So one thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to pick one thing and stick to it. But what you do want to do is you want to look across boundaries and combine different kinds of data here. Okay, and the last thing that we might want to look at here is number 6, mind the system, right? So if you create the most awesome digital health app, you basically, or when you create it, you have 2 possible customers or target groups. Number 1 is the end customer, right? Like you and me. Number 2 is a user inside the healthcare system, right? When you go into the healthcare system, there is a whole process of evidence-based medicine that surrounds it, right? So before your application gets adopted in a clinical setting, you have to create evidence that it actually works for the patients it's supposed to work for, right? And possibly even get captured in clinical guidelines as a recommendation for use in a clinical setting, right? So if you want to go into the healthcare system with a digital health app, you have to consider this, and you should also start early with it because it can take quite a long time. Okay, so the take home. Health data is everywhere, right? It just pervades our lives nowadays. And it's in surprising places where we might not have expected it at first, right? If you want to go into digital health, just go now, right? It's the thing to do right now, I would say. And while you're doing it, look at standards that are available, learn from standards, right? And make your stuff interoperable. Apply domain knowledge, right? Know how your pipeline might have to be adjusted so it can work with health data. Look at regulatory quite early, even if you're just getting an impression of what to expect, know what to expect. Be aware of the quality and the biases in your data, and just be creative, right? Look outside the box, be creative, and have fun. Thanks.